Welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. This is Throwback Thursday. One Thursday each month, we take a trip back in time to a previous podcast. With so many new visitors to the podcast, I thought it was a good time to get back to some of the good stuff we've had from the past. So join me now as we travel back in time. This podcast interview was recorded November 14, 2017. Today we get a different perspective about relationships and OCD from a couple that are dealing with OCD on a daily basis. Jeff has OCD and Nancy does not. Nancy and Jeff were married in October of 2009 and just celebrated their 8th anniversary. They were both born and raised in Connecticut and moved to South Carolina after being married for 5 years. Jeff had gone to UNC Charlotte, so he was familiar with the Carolinas and had always wanted to come back. It was difficult to leave his family behind, but they felt this was the best move for them. Jeff works in the insurance industry, and Nancy is a licensed practical nurse. It has not been easy for them to move away from their family, but they have made a lot of friends here and found their place and are loving it so far. Growing up, OCD was not really an issue for Jeff. He was what you might call a typical boy. He did occasionally have some problems with people washing their hands before touching some of his personal belongings, but other than that, life was pretty normal. Jeff started experiencing OCD symptoms in 2005 and was diagnosed in 2008. Right around the time he started dating Nancy, and she has been with him every step of the way through all the good and bad times. So let's find out more about them. Let's go to the interview now. Well, Jeff and Nancy, I really appreciate you being here on the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I've been through OCD from the vantage point of my daughter, and so I know that as a relationship, and I know my own relationship with my wife, who neither of us have OCD, and how it affected us. But it's really interesting to see a perspective from a couple that one person does have OCD and the other doesn't. So I'm so glad you're here to talk about that and kind of get that out there.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So I guess we'll start out. I'd like, if you could, and I'd like both of you to kind of tell just a little brief story about yourself that's involved with what we're talking about tonight.
Okay, I'll start. So my name is Nancy. Growing up in my household, I grew up with 2 older sisters, and things were pretty much a typical family. We didn't have any problems or any conditions or anything in the house that anybody had that caused anything to be different than other families. I went to to college, and I majored in psychology. Believe it or not, my senior project was about OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, and I never knew that at some point I would actually be quote unquote living with it, or living with somebody that has it. Once I met Jeff, where we used to work together, and as we started dating more, we kind of started talking about that, and he was diagnosed with it, and I knew I needed to keep learning as much as possible about OCD, so we started going to therapy together, and then that kind of continued once we even got married, and we just kind of tried to work things out together.
Maybe there was some kind of divine intervention there that brought the OCD to you because you were learning about it, Anyway, so Jeff, what about you?
Well, just like Nancy, I grew up a very typical family. I was your average boy. My mom used to have to fight me to get into the shower and bathe me, and I was always into everything, and which is very surprising because that is not the way I am now. Growing up, I did have, looking back, I noticed that I did have a few tendencies Like, for example, like when I used to have people come over and play my video game systems, I would ask them to wash their hands first because I didn't like the way that the greasy hand fingerprint feeling felt on the remote controls of the Nintendo system. But other than that, that was really the only thing that I noticed. And it wasn't until actually after I got out of college where I purchased my first car, brand new, right out of the, right off the lot, is where my OCD really came full force. I would spend hours and through the middle of the night, through the day, constantly walking around, checking for scratches and imperfections and constantly cleaning it even though it didn't need to be cleaned. And that is what really was my starting point. Then I would start with hand washing. The hand washing started with, went into working with turning the lights on and off, just trying to think of other things, checking under my bed, under my dresser, have to like turn the lights on and off 4 or 5 times. And, it wasn't until actually after Nancy and I met where I finally had enough that I went to a therapist and I was diagnosed. And I never thought that I actually would have something like this. It's definitely changed my life. And I'm just happy that I have Nancy as a support system because it's definitely very hard to do alone. And, I actually have been with a girlfriend who actually used to tease me and make fun of me about it. So that was definitely a big challenge because I was so embarrassed to open up. Yeah. And Nancy was very accepting, and that's when I really knew that she loved me because she loved me for who I am, and this is who I am.
Yeah.
So, it was definitely a challenge in the beginning, but once I met Nancy, things definitely got much better.
I understand the support factor. Having, even like with I did, having that tag team effect with my wife to be able to go in when we were, that 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night battles where you had to go, I'm tired, you're next, go, kind of thing. So I understand that. So what would you say as a relationship, what do you find are your biggest obstacles that you run into?
Some of the obstacles that we run into are when we have plans to go do something, sometimes Jeff might get involved in a ritual, or he might be having a hard time leaving the house because something might not be just right according to his standards. And sometimes it's just hard to leave. We need to meet with other people and we have to try to explain what's going on and why we were late. That is something that we do struggle with sometimes.
Another thing that we struggle with, and this is a big one, is most of our family lives in Connecticut, and we're currently residing in South Carolina. And we have a hard time I have a hard time when people come over the house because most of my OCD revolves and is focused on things that I own. As I mentioned, when it was that first car that I bought, I was living with my parents, so that was the only thing that I had of value. So that is where all the focus was. But when I bought my house, the cars just kind of went away, and now it's on the house, I have a hard time with little children because their kids will be kids, and it's them touching everything and like with their greasy hands and their slimy hands. I mean, because I just remember how my hands used to be when I was a kid. And I mean, kids will be kids, but I have a really hard time because I can't control what they are going to do. And when they're in the house, all I think about is that they're going to be touching everything. And that in my head, that makes me feel like it's going to get ruined. When people stay with us, I just have in my head that something's going to break, something's going to get ruined, something's going to be touched that I'm not going to be able to fix, and then I'm going to be stuck with this problem. So we have had struggles having people over. We do make it work, but our biggest challenge is we have tension between ourselves because I try my best to not be rude or make the person who's staying with us uncomfortable. It's sometimes, our tension overflows and we start arguing with one another. And, I don't like that. And, it's not the way I wish it could be, but that's just what, to me, that's just our biggest struggle.
I would ask you as to how you see the difference between, say, your marriage and what you might call, let's call it a typical marriage. I don't know if that's the right wording or not, but how would you see the difference?
I think that Jeff and I, we really do kind of have I feel like a special bond, because from the start, from day one when we started dating, everybody kind of has their quirks and things that they do that may bother the other person. But with Jeff, I just kind of really developed this patience with him and his rituals that he was doing and acting on his compulsions. I mean, marriage already is tough to start with.
Yeah.
Never mind trying to add OCD into that. I'd hate to make it sound like OCD can be a hindrance on a marriage, but it does make things a little tougher. You have to work harder. One thing that our family always says about us is how well we work together with things, even if it's just a house project or doing yard work or something, but we always do stuff together. And I think that we kind of created that bond and that togetherness of doing things because of working on his OCD right from the start, that we just kind of always had to work harder at things.
I agree with that, everything that Nancy says. I mean, I feel like at times we have our challenges, but for the most part, we are a typical married couple. We go on trips, vacations, we do fun things like whitewater rafting and parasailing. We love going hiking. I mean, we're adventurous, and we love doing things together. It's really my struggles is when I'm in my home. That's where my OCD comes out mostly. And it's really, I think having the OCD has made my communication with Nancy, like our form of communication is just spot on. Like we almost finish each other's sentences now because we're so close. I just thought it's always brought us closer. And since I depend on Nancy so much, I think that's why our bond is so strong, because I can't see myself living with OCD with anyone else because she's been so supportive. I mean, she's not perfect. I mean, I'm sure I drive her crazy, and she's been very patient with me. I mean, everybody has like their boiling point or their breaking point. She's pretty close to perfect when it comes to those things. So, it's great to have that support system,
That is wonderful. Are there things that you really feel like you can't do that other couples can do?
Well, one thing that we tried to do, I didn't bring this up to Nancy before, but because it's kind of a tough subject, but about 6 years ago, we actually tried to get a dog. We both love dogs. I grew up with dogs. Nancy grew up with dogs. We're big animal lovers. When we tried to have a dog in our first home, I kind of had a breakdown. It just made me feel so uneasy that I actually was so lost in my OCD that I actually started thinking suicidal thoughts, which, thinking about it now, I can't believe I got to that point, but it was just the uneasiness in my own home because I felt like my home was my safe place. The dog, it was a rescue dog, so she was not like a typical puppy where she clearly had something wrong with her. She must have had a abusive past or something, but she just was all over the place, and I was constantly walking around and cleaning up after her and picking up the dog hair that I couldn't do it. And I started talking about hurting myself, and, we actually had to bring the dog back to the shelter, and it was hard to do because, like I said, I'm such a huge animal lover. I was afraid of scratches getting on our hardwood floors and drool getting all over the place on the leather couches, and it was controlling my life thinking about that, and I couldn't sleep for 2 days. That was probably, I would say, the hardest thing that I have gone through since I've had my OCD, was that incident, because I was at such a low in my life. I'm just, and again, another, bringing back to the last question, I was heartbroken because I know how important it was for Nancy to have, for us to have a dog. But she was there. She was supportive. She didn't resent me. She didn't make me feel guilty. I'm sure she was sad about it. And we always talk about it, that we wish it could have worked out. I just couldn't live in the house with one. It breaks my heart because I love animals, and I have such a big heart, but for some reason just can't seem to control the OCD and how it makes me feel in my own home.
We did, however, recently start a fish tank, which was a nice project for the both of us to do together, and it's safe and they don't make a mess. And we enjoy watching them because it's relaxing.
Yeah.
So that was nice to bring some fish into the home.
Yeah, you just can't take them for a walk or anything like that. So
No.
what kind of advice would you give other couples that, that may not have been as lucky as you to be able to start from the very beginning of this thing, and that have come into the middle of it or come into realization in the middle of it? Is there any thoughts that you might have even for them that would help them?
I think it's important to try and remember, and although it's going to be hard, but remember why you got married in the first place. You got married to this person because you loved them and you wanted to spend the rest of your life with them. You took an oath and a promise to stay together in good and bad, no matter what. When you're married, you can't just give up and break apart and, go your separate ways because you took that oath. You have to definitely be patient with one another, and you have to communicate with one another. You have to be open to giving feedback, whether it's good or bad. Try not to be too sensitive. Now, I will admit in the past there's been things in the beginning that Jeff did when we first lived together, once we were married, that caused me to be sensitive about it and where I may be sad, and he would have to wipe it off, and I always felt like maybe I was causing things to be worse for him. But you have to just work together against the OCD, not against each other. You just take it one day at a time. You're going to definitely have your ups and downs. Some days good, some days not so good. I know for me personally, I have to keep in mind that these rituals or things that Jeff does or things, they're not his fault. He doesn't want to be this way, and it's not hard. It is hard to remember that all the time. You can come up with a plan with one another. So when he, for instance, might start looking at the way things are on a wall, we've been given advice from a friend. He's allowed to ask 3 questions, or ask me 3 times, how does it look? After the 3rd time, we're done talking about it. So then that way, we don't keep going on and on about it. We've set timers on the microwave for him, and that's how long he's allowed to clean for after dinner. But it's good if you develop a plan and talk about it ahead of time. Don't just throw at him, well, you get 30 seconds and that's it. So we've come up with some things to help with that. But patience and communications it's just vital to make it through and to be there for one another.
Yeah, and I just would like to add the most important thing to me, besides everything that Nancy said, is that you don't want to keep OCD just to yourself. You want to be as honest with your wife, your husband, your partner, or boyfriend, girlfriend. You always want to be honest. You want to tell them how you're feeling. And for the significant other who does not have the OCD, you want to be supportive, but you don't want to enable or partake in the OCD. A very important thing that my therapist would tell us, because Nancy actually would come to therapies to kind of understand how it worked and just to get some advice, is that Nancy or whoever the significant other, they need to live their own life. And you can't have them partake in your OCD. So I can't have Nancy wash her hands before she touches something. Mm-hmm. I can't have her turn the lights on a certain amount of times, or go and check the faucets or check the locks. she has to live her own life. I have to live mine. But that doesn't mean she can't be supported. I just am very strong. I strongly recommend and suggest just not to enable it, because I just think that's going to make it worse other than making it better.
Yeah, and I totally agree, because we went through the same thing. You end up feeding it instead of helping it, and one thing and I think, Nancy, you kind of touched on this, and one thing my wife always did for me was to say we had to do things with compassion, and we had to remember that was this was my daughter and this was OCD, and always remember that my daughter was inside of there, no matter how rough it got. And to talk, and we had to be strong, we had to be, make some decisions and stop some things, but we always had to do it with compassion. So I think that's really great, Nancy. I know that's kind of what you touched on, that you have to remember that's why you love that person, that's Jeff inside of there, even though he's, going off at a little bit of a tangent kind of thing. So that's great. Well, guys, I again, so much appreciate your openness in this. This has been a great conversation, and I hope in doing this that we're able to let other couples that are in the same situation know, one, that there's hope, and two, that it can be done, that you still can live a normal life, as you may call it, So I again, appreciate it so much, and thank you for being part of this.
Thank you again for having us.
Thank you again for having us.
It's fun to travel back in time and listen to past events and podcasts. Maybe you have a story from the past about how you overcame OCD, or maybe you want to tell what you're going through right now dealing with OCD. We want to hear about it. Simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com, and on the left-hand side you'll see a little area that says Stories from the OCD Side. Click there and tell us all about it. We'll be happy to listen and put you out there. And remember, my wife and I are here to help you with your OCD and your anxiety. Simply go to familyocd.com or focusedhealthyfamily.com, and there you can connect with us and get a free consult to find out if we can help you. Thank you for visiting us today on the Visible Wheelchair Podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you the next time.